What is autism? Autism is essentially a neurological disorder of the brain. There's no known cause, there's no known cure, although there are some suspicions as far as what the cause may be. But there is a track record of many children with autism spectrum disorder achieving a significant degree of success in mainstreaming and helping children adapt and possibly be independent later in life through various therapies. So before dealing with a divorce of parents of a child with autism, it's helpful to know and to consider what an intact family might consider doing when they have a child newly diagnosed with autism. Because whatever an intact family may do is something which a separated or divorced family may aspire to do, if in fact it will be helpful to the child. So first of all, with children with autism, it's usually very helpful to have an early diagnosis. An early diagnosis allows the child when they're very young and when there's what's called the plasticity of the brain and the brain is still developing to be able to be trained, some feel, more easily towards a mainstreamed life than it would be for a child who's diagnosed later in life. That does not mean that a child who's diagnosed later in life cannot be helped. They can be. But the younger, the better, generally, is the theory, which very often is put out there. So in order to get an early diagnosis of a child with autism, sometimes parents disagree as to whether a child has autism or not. Sometimes one parent or both are actually fearful of getting the diagnosis. They avoid the diagnosis. They avoid even bringing a child to a doctor to be diagnosed because of what might occur. But it's usually very helpful to get the diagnosis if a child, in fact, is on the autism spectrum, because that means that child may qualify for services earlier. And you can get an early jump on trying to help the child to hopefully become mainstream later in life. So some of the symptoms of autism, and this is just by way of illustration, this is not meant to be an all-inclusive list or to diagnose anybody, but some of the more common traits that you tend to see with many children with autism is, for example, limited or no eye contact, difficulty making eye contact, limited or no speech. If a child is going beyond the age where he or she should be talking and they're not talking, that might be a warning sign that possibly, not definitely, but possibly the child is on the autism spectrum, especially if it matches up with some of the other symptoms we're talking about, such as minimal eye contact. A child with autism might parrot words of somebody else, or even if they can't speak, if they're just repeating what someone else has just said, that's what's known as echolalia, where the child is simply just repeating what they've heard. A lack of response to initiation of conversation. Self-stimulating activities, such as arm flapping, spinning in circles, rocking back and forth, or even head banging, which can be dangerous, a child banging their head on the floor, where some children with autism actually wear a helmet to protect their head from being, from injury. Perseveration on inanimate objects, obsessive compulsive conduct, like lining up objects in a row, shower shampoo caps, things like that. A need for sameness in routine, such as food choices, clothes. Many children with autism, they have what's called sensory integration dysfunction, where the feel of the clothes is bothersome to them, so they actually turn their clothes inside out so that the stitching doesn't bother their skin. Some children with autism have a heightened interest in seemingly random information, lists of things. Hypersensitive hearing. Some children with autism actually, it's been reported that they start getting headaches when they sit under fluorescent lights because of a hypersensitivity. Low muscle tone. Challenges in gross and fine motor skills. So these are just some of the symptoms. But if a child has a few of these symptoms or more, it may be worth getting at least a diagnosis to at least rule out autism or rule in autism, as the case may be. So when a child has autism and is diagnosed with autism, the early diagnosis can be very helpful. But what's also helpful is generally early intervention or intense early intervention. That means once the diagnosis has taken place, to start working on the issues as soon as possible. Some people call that the window of opportunity. When a child is very young in age, under the age of 5, and you get the diagnosis, The brain is more, the term is used as plastic. There's a plasticity of the brain. It's more flexible to learn new things than it might be later in life. As I said earlier, it doesn't mean you can't learn things later in life, but it might be more helpful to the child to learn earlier in terms of going through the therapies that might help the child ultimately be mainstream. There's a certain type of therapy that some of you may have heard of called applied behavioral analysis, called ABA therapy. That's certainly not the only therapy out there, but is one of the more historical and traditional therapies, which are used for often for children with autism spectrum disorder. There's a famous study that goes back many, many years to UCLA, a professor named Dr. Lovis, who essentially studied children with autism. And the results of his findings were the more intense the early intervention is and the early diagnosis, perhaps the better chance there is to have significant success with a child with autism in terms of mainstream. Again, that was a study. It's not the only study out there, but it's one which you may read about if you're reading about autism, the Lovis study. And one of the goals of autism in terms of administering therapy and educational intervention for children with autism is to try to avoid stagnation and regression. This is why, for example, when a child is classified for special education, very often they have what's called an extended school year, an ESY program, because the concern is that if a child is off for the summer, whatever they learned during the school year may be lost during the summer because they're not consistently and constantly repeating it and reinforcing it. So, in many schools, the summer program includes many children with autism in order to support progression and positive movement rather than stagnation or worse, regression. And then also one of the goals of autism is to take whatever is learned in therapy for a child and try to generalize that into the community. So if a child is doing very well in a classroom setting with a special education teacher, but they're not reinforcing what they've learned out in the community, those skills may be limited to just the classroom. So it's important to try to transition those skills into the community as well, to take what you're learning in the classroom and use it out in the community. And this very often requires a team effort. It certainly involves the parents, should involve the parents, the teachers, if they're private therapists involved, really everybody working together for a consistent approach to what the child may need. I referenced earlier, children with autism sometimes don't do very well with transition and newness of things. That doesn't mean to avoid everything that's new, because life requires a lot of new steps. But for everyone to be on the same page in terms of consistency of approach and in terms of expanding what the child is learning into a more generalized community approach can potentially be helpful to the child in many instances. So when you're talking about a divorce, a separation divorce, when you have parents who are working together and are on the same page in terms of at least how you're going to handle the child's needs relative to autism, it can be more helpful and can strengthen the approach as opposed to two parents who are working against each other or have two completely different views on things, or one side is undermining the other, either actively or passively by not doing their share, by not reinforcing, by not generalizing, by not following the consistency of approach that's taking place in one house versus another. It could send very, very significant mixed messages to a child who already may have challenges in terms of being able to learn through different approaches as opposed to a similar approach. So this is something which parents who are separating or divorcing and have a child with autism need to keep in mind and discuss with some of the professionals involved with the child's care and education, special education teachers, therapists, etc. It's also important for the parents to hopefully be on the same page relative to financial issues concerning the child and the autism-related needs, as well as emotional issues, emotional support for the child, as well as any siblings who may be involved in the family dynamic as well. So in our next video, we're going to be talking about some of the issues concerning custody and parenting time. But for purposes of this introductory video, keep in mind that when parents get divorced, they may be divorcing each other, but they're not divorcing their child. And if there's a child with special needs, in the long run, it is generally helpful if the parents can invest their time and energy into working together, regardless of whether they disagree on everything else in their lives, if they can invest in the time and energy and working together in having a united front relative to how to approach the child's needs relative to autism spectrum disorder, it could be doing a tremendous service to their child even after separation or divorce.